Okay, so coming back to this, the burning of Washington actually had an interesting counterpoint, something that had happened in Europe just recently, a couple years before. That was the burning of Moscow, which I just mentioned that as a kind of something that overlaps and yet is different from it. The burning of this city happened amid Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia. Napoleon actually became the kind of successor to the French Revolution of sorts, the Emperor of France, and proceeded on this mission of conquest all across Europe, bringing his militaries and also, you could say, a modernizing influence, and eventually decided that he was going to invade Russia. The city of Moscow gets there and discovers the city's actually abandoned. And this is one of those historical events that's still endlessly debated, whether the French soldiers burned it down, whether the people who were there, the Russians living there, burned it down, or whether it was a kind of accident that grew out of just the occupation, something that's depicted in Leo Tolstoy's very famous novel, War and Peace. I guess you could say, as a counterpoint, the city itself, Moscow, was destroyed, accidentally or not, in this kind of chaotic fire. Whereas, as I said, Washington, D.C., the burning of this city was kind of more of a strategic, tactical thing, more of a kind of controlled fire, if you can put it in that way. The British clearly were not intent on completely destroying America as it existed. So, just as the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the burning of Washington, burning of Moscow, these kinds of counterpoint things that give us a sense of the global scope. So the aftermath of the war, the era of good feelings, which is kind of a funny name for a time period, the return of the political binary, Jacksonian democracy, and the Industrial Revolution. After the War of 1812, a new period began in America, colloquially known as the era of good feelings. And there you can see a kind of glossy image of what such an era might entail had it really been true. It has this title because the Federalist Party, the other political party, was effectively bankrupt and destroyed by the War of 1812. And so you had a superficial sense of unity. You just had one ruling political party, the Democratic Republicans, and basically you also had this kind of sort of sense of unity within the nation as a whole, and you had a couple of one-sided elections. These were just kind of landslides, or I don't think the election in 1820, I don't think was even contested, both won by James Monroe. I say won because it was a foregone conclusion. I think the significance of this era is here we see an example of the ideal of national unity that America constantly seeks, that it has been seeking, I think, since the very inception of the country. From the very beginning, there's been this kind of search for a unified or homogenous idea of America, where everyone kind of pulls together and really fits under the umbrella of one culture, one political system, and to a degree even one way of thinking. And how many times have we actually seen that in American history? From the very beginning, you have regionalism, regional differences between the North and the South. I talked about it, differences between New England and Virginia. From the very beginning, you have English colonials versus Native Americans, but you also have sharp class divisions among the English colonials, with so many of them being indentured servants. Then you have the presence of African slaves. You have the diversity of immigration into the country. You have all the splintering religious groups as well. Look at all the religions that exist in America, many of which trace their roots back to the beginning or close to the beginning. Puritans, Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, and so on and so forth. You have the division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. You have Irish immigrants coming in, more in the way of a different strain of religion with Catholicism, and so on and so forth. And the unity, such as it is, the only time I can remember anything resembling a kind of American unity in my lifetime was right after the terrorist attacks 9/11. That was the sense in which America kind of saw itself as being a single nation, and that's when the president at the time, George W. Bush's approval rating soared, not because of anything he had done, but just because of the attacks themselves. But how ephemeral, how short-lived, right? It doesn't last. It's a couple of years, and then you immediately have this kind of breakdown, not only into diversity, but even more importantly than that, partisan divides. The kind of us versus them mentality, which prevails across the history of the country. So here, the era of good feelings, here, again, you have an example of a sort of short-lived sense or impression of unity, but something that was kind of doomed from the start. What does unity actually mean, though? What does it mean in a country like America? Well, for the most part, it's a kind of a mask or a gloss. Usually, it's not real. And I would say that it's during the periods where we see those instances of so-called national unity that some of the worst decisions are made, right? Because it's exactly the lack of opposition where that's the opportunity to kind of push through all sorts of ridiculous measures, including the war in Afghanistan, for instance, in 2001. And so this is a kind of just a superficial coating. And as far as this era goes, it seemed to mask the disjointed and directionless state of American politics. Without the binary, without the divide, it was almost as though there was a loss of purpose, right? You almost need that kind of dichotomous opposition in order to get anything done. And not only that, but partisan conflicts and fears of internal enemies were stronger than ever in the country. So there's still all the kind of same dynamics operating in the country at the time. Still that kind of fear of people who are working within the American government secretly trying to bring us down from the inside. It was still a perspective and mentality at the time. It just wasn't necessarily codified in this rigid binary. So I say there, the monopoly, because it was kind of a monopoly, concealed them while also promoting a series of factional disputes with no clear focus. Factional just means kind of infighting or kind of squabbling over smallish things. All the good feelings, such as they were, came to a screeching halt with a split in the National Party, which gave birth to the Democrats and Republicans and the election of Andrew Jackson in 1828. And, of course, the significance of that is there are the two political parties that exist to this day. So originally one kind of unified political party during the era of good feelings. The Federalists were gone, were dead, and then you have the split, and that's what we have ever since then. The Democrats and Republicans, their agendas have changed profoundly over the years. I still hear these stories about kind of invoking certain Democrat or Republican presidents from the 19th century. Lincoln, for instance, I think Trump mentioned him as being someone who was a Republican, and that's supposed to be really significant. Doesn't matter. I mean, the Republican Party in the 19th century is not the same as the party today. The only thing that stayed the same is this sense of division and split. Andrew Jackson makes a kind of really interesting case study in American history. And here's someone who's also very contested and conflicted. I think there was an attempt made to tear down his statue in D.C. And also, I believe he's on the $20 bill in America. And there's all sorts of talk about taking him off of that money. I don't know if they have any plans to do that because he's a contradictory figure in many ways. Similar to Thomas Jefferson, he was a national hero, a war hero, especially from the War of 1812. And like Jefferson as well, he supported the ideal of the independent, self-made farmer, only in a raw, more personal sense, because Jackson came from very kind of humble beginnings, a humble background. So he wasn't someone who was born into a prominent family, but someone who kind of fit the ideal of the American dream person who kind of works their way up slowly under their own steam. And this kind of notion of this kind of the farmer, the pioneer, the person out on the frontier. I mean, Jefferson supported that. Jackson supported that. Again, a kind of big part of the American psyche, the individual who is far removed from the center of power. So not someone who works in the upper echelons of society, and certainly not someone born into a wealthy, prominent family, but just someone who is kind of out there on the frontier, like the figure of the cowboy. for instance. I mean, that idea of the cowboy is so central to American culture and identity, and it suits a particular version of this self-made person free from the constraints of institutions. As such, due to his background and also his kind of perspective on this, he pushed for a broader, more inclusive idea of democracy that would eliminate class divisions and break up the monopolistic power of the wealthy. In effect, he was essentially looking for a version of democracy which would be quite familiar to us today. This notion of equality and egalitarianism and individual rights, and especially the idea of expanding suffrage radically. Now, keep in mind, it did not encompass the entire population, did not encompass the majority of the population, of course, as women did not have the right to vote at this time, but it was certainly kind of an idea of democracy that would do away with certain class divisions and restrictions that said you had to own property, or you had to be a wealthy person in order to vote, in order to participate in the government. And as I say there, it was kind of a radical vision of democracy, and that's part of the reason why he's still kind of extolled in the American legacy of presidents. But his vision of democracy also reinforced a hardline intersectional divide in America. And I mentioned this previously as well. As this idea of equality and individual rights expanded, and had been going on in the 1700s, happening again in the 1800s, as it's expanding, it's becoming more kind of rigid in terms of who qualifies for that. And I say on intersectional grounds, basically refers to things like gender, race, ethnicity, religion, class. Well, this was a version of democracy that was embracing white male Americans. That's essentially the targets of Jacksonian democracy. What happens to, for instance, African slaves? Because slavery still exists at this time. Talk about that in next class. Also Native Americans, where they're just left out of this version of American democracy. Doesn't apply to them. So it's a way of kind of codifying a version of American democracy, but one that only applies to a demographic segment of the population. You could say that this version of democracy that Jackson was promoting and developing was in many respects a response to another event that was occurring at this time in the early 19th century. Again, something you might remember if you took the class last semester, and that would be the Industrial Revolution. It was largely due to the connection to Britain that industrialization came to America early. And that was in contrast to other places in the America, for instance, in South and Central America. The Industrial Revolution started in Britain, which was the main driving force in the growth of the British Empire, and that had dramatic consequences for Britain and also for America, because industrialization kind of spilled over into America at this time, and thus the profound changes of industrialization came to America early. What kinds of changes? Well, again, as I talked about last semester, these were sweeping, dramatic changes that touch the very core of human identity. But just in practical terms, we could talk about rapid population growth, which happens with industrialization. You have increasing population numbers in America, but you don't quite have this sort of exponential growth that you see afterwards. Urbanization as well, the tendency of people to live in cities and towns. Prior to industrialization, most people live in the countryside in rural settings and work as that self-made farmer that Jackson is talking about. Well, the trend in the early 19th century is towards this kind of landscape, the urban landscape, city centers, and people working in factories. So not on farms, but in factories, and all sorts of other new things, such as laying railroad tracks, all the different things that would emerge out of steam power, electricity later on, big machinery. All of those things came to America and helped build up a rapidly growing urban population, especially in the north, especially in the northern states and the coastal regions as well. So as I said, the new democracy in America, which is often termed Jacksonian democracy, was in part a response to the pressures of industrialization. It's almost this way of navigating something that was happening to America. You see an image of, I think that's Boston in the 19th century. And suddenly you have all these factories and you have the development of a kind of a corporate manufacturing world. And the question is, how is this all going to be divvied up or divided among the people? Well, on the one hand, you have the risk of a type of landed gentry controlling the rise of manufacturing. So in other words, people who are already born into privileged positions, people who already were wealthy, basically controlling the growth of the manufacturing sector, which was generally the case in a country like Britain. But on the other hand, there was also the risk that industrialization would simply produce a new version of an elite class that hoarded landed wealth. So if there was a lot more wealth to be had, if there was a lot more money rolling through America, there was this risk that it was just going to be controlled by very few people. Small segment of the population was going to have everything, and the great masses of people at the lower end of the pyramid were going to be left out. And so you could say, to give this version of democracy its fair due, that it was actually kind of pushing back against that as much as it could by trying to expand individual rights to the people who were in the city centers, involved in working in these factories. And so that became the kind of ideal of democracy and also the American dream. But again, not for everybody in the country, but for a segment of the population. Finally, the last topic to discuss, westward expansion and the Indian Removal Act. Here you see a couple of these topics to consider: confronting the event and the narrative, government justifications, and native assessments. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, so that was during Jackson's presidency and also in part under his initiative. This was a campaign to move various Native American groups from their ancestral homes to reservations west of the Mississippi. And there you can see some of the actual homes, the different groups and who occupied this land, different groups and tribes. And this was process of expelling basically up to 100,000 people, 60 to 100,000 people from these areas to a place west of the Mississippi, which would be designated essentially as a reservation. There are actually a series of different measures that were adopted in the early 19th century, but the Indian Removal Act in particular was the kind of institutionalization of this process. And as I say, particularly in the Cherokee Trail of Tears, as it was called, many people died in this process as they were basically kicked out of their ancestral homes and moved to these reservations west of the Mississippi. I say there, simplistic narratives often present this removal as a one-way act perpetrated against helpless victims for nefarious purposes. And of course, we can look at it in that way. But I say the responses to and consequences of these acts were ultimately just as important to the formation of an American national identity as the reasons behind them. So we have to look at the reasons, the rationale adopted by the U.S. government, their own kind of hypocritical self-justifying explanations. But I think even more importantly, we also have to look at the consequences on the Native American people and their reactions, their responses to it, because there you actually see them speaking back to the American government, showing the American government, indeed showing the American nation what it actually is, giving it a portrait of itself through these kinds of actions. One thing to keep in mind was that the American population was increasing significantly at this time. This is partly due to industrialization, but also the stream of immigrants into the country that I mentioned last time. And you can see that over the course of a single generation, this is quite a significant amount of increase from something like 4 million people. Once you start getting close to 1830, you have almost 13 million people, so a threefold increase. This is referring to American citizens as such, so it's not taking into account everybody, but population explosion with an increasing birth rate, but also more and more immigrants entering America. So a growing, sizable population along the eastern seaboard and inland. Jackson's administration worked from the premise that the encroachment and invasion of Native American lands were already occurring. So in terms of the justification that the U.S. government gave for basically kicking these people off of their ancestral homes, of shipping them out to places that they'd never been, to these reservations, the justification, the rationale was that American people, these vast growing numbers here, were already invading their land. They were already encroaching on their territory. The pioneers were already occupying these places, and they were basically in the process of taking everything over. Thus, acts of removal could be framed as attempts to prevent the haphazard destruction of an entire nation of people. And this was the picture of the so-called benevolent government that Andrew Jackson did present at the time as being the main justification. In other words, the idea here is if we don't do something, if we don't have some kind of strategy or plan in place, what's going to happen is a bunch of European Americans are basically not only going to occupy the land of the Cherokee, the Seminoles, the other native groups, they're not only going to occupy their land, but they're going to completely wipe these people out. The entire nation is going to collapse in short order. So this is a kind of a strategy based on tackling that problem, tackling that issue. Now, to give due credit to, government intentions are never benevolent, really, when you get down to it, but to give due credit to the U.S. policy at the time, they were probably right in that assessment. That was what was happening at this time. American settlers and pioneers were taking over the native territory, and they were tearing apart the nations, the groups, the tribes that existed at this time. And it was perfectly possible that in the course of a generation, all of this land, the territory that I mentioned before, would already be occupied, nations disbanded, and effectively destroyed. So that was basically one side of the kind of narrative they were presenting. But of course, as I said, government intentions are never really beneficent, right? The government never really intends to do something good just for the sake of it. There's always that kind of ulterior motive, which is much more significant to them. And I say there, the underlying basis of this involved a desire to define and gain control over American identity and land through acquisition and opposition. In other words, the idea here is to kind of shore up what exactly it means to be an American citizen. And the subtext of that was that Native Americans could not assimilate into America. There have been various attempts to create that kind of assimilation previously, attempts that amounted to essentially denying native cultural identities and practices. Christian missionaries, of course, have been heavily involved in that, essentially imposing their version of religion onto people who already had their religions. So there had to be these attempts at kind of cultural assimilation, if not cultural destruction, but the Native American people were still forming independent cultural identities at this time. So this was the kind of idea of saying, well, the Native Americans can't be American. We've tried to do that, so now we simply have to remove them from the entire ambit, the entire umbrella of America, and this will allow us to define what it does mean to be American. So often these questions of national identity, or what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a subject of a particular nation state, they often proceed exactly through these terms: acquisition and opposition. The acquisition of land, of resources, and opposition as well. Defining what somebody is by determining what they are not. So if you're this kind of person, it stands in opposition to who? To Native Americans, to slaves, even to women, as the case might be when it comes to voting rights. So it's kind of codifying that identity. The acts of removal fed into a paradigm that aimed to codify connection between the American nation and a particular understanding of land as well. The idea of being born on American soil, which is one of those terms we often hear as this kind of almost idealistic thing to aspire towards, even though it's just an accident, right? You don't have any control over that. But you can see that developing at this time, that kind of push and pull in the American relationship to land. Originally, in the colonial settler period, you had these vast tracts of land and not enough people there to live on it and work on it. Hence, the importation of servants and then slaves and then streams of new immigrants. That was the kind of perception. We have a ton of land out here and we just need to build up the numbers of people, the cheap labor. But when you get into the early 19th century, there's more of this kind of interpretation of, okay, what does it mean not only to be an American citizen, but what does it mean to talk about American land itself? What is it about this particular territory or this region that makes it American? What is it that turns it into the kind of birthright of the American people? You could say that the pioneers, despite being these kinds of independent-minded individuals, they certainly brought that kind of capitalist idea and framework to the land. It's about exploiting the land. It's about mining it for resources. It's about working and tilling the land as much as possible, getting it to pay off in some concrete sense. As I said, when we look at this, we have to take into account this idea of the Native reactions and responses to the acts of removal and also what they ultimately entailed. There you see Black Hawk, a leader of the Sauk people who were located in the area that would become Wisconsin. And in their relations with Americans, the Sauk leaders tended to refer to their counterparts in paternal terms as father. So they would talk about their relations or interactions with American colonials as though they were fathers. And this, I would say, fits into a larger sequence of narratives and ideas of Native American people foreshadowing what would happen in their relation with the European invaders, foreshadowing or anticipating what would happen in their relations with Americans, and this became part of their culture as well. So this kind of is a way to break apart just this idea of the natives as these kinds of helpless victims who just stood there as stuff happened to them. Well, they did have their own perspectives, their own views, and their own ideas. And this became part of their culture as well, responding and reacting to the movements and the policies of the American government. Here we have one example. The Sauk people referring to the Americans as their kind of paternal guardians in a way. Well, if the U.S. government was being cast in a paternalistic role, we should ask the question of what kind of fathers were they actually? Because here we could see something that would shape also the American psyche and American cultural identity. Well, for these fathers, you could say certain things are unavoidable. That was how they were presenting this idea of westward expansion. It was something that was already occurring with these pioneers and settlers occupying the land. The American colonials were going to continue going out into native territory, and there was nothing we could do to prevent it. And certainly the U.S. government was not going to intervene on the behalf of the native people. But beyond that, there's another kind of sense in which things are unavoidable or just inexorable. The idea that progress, capitalist exploitation, the imposition of industry and infrastructure, those two are things that cannot be avoided. The sort of movement of progress and development across the frontier has to happen. So put yourself in that position of imagining this kind of father figure, which is actually a government, but you can think of it metaphorically as a father figure saying, look, you can't do anything about this. This is just the way the world is. So stop complaining, stop resisting. You just have to go along with this thing that is already taking place. That's the kind of father figure that the American government is in this situation. Also, the protection that they offer carries with it a sacrifice of autonomy. So in other words, the American government is in a position where it says we're going to protect the Native American people. They might be decimated and destroyed by our own citizens, so we have to intervene on their behalf, offer them this sheltering, protective veneer. Yeah, but it comes with the loss of freedom, the loss of individual liberty, the loss of occupying their own land, making their own decisions. They're moved effectively to reservations, which are now under the control of the U.S. government. So again, as that kind of father figure, that idea of, well, I'll take care of you, I'll help you, give you protection and security, but I'm going to lock you in my house as well. and you have to follow exactly my rules, and you don't have any options outside of that. Finally, they are fathers who lie to, quote, their children, right? Because they're not telling the truth about certain things, such as the permanence of the reservations themselves. You take a look at what would be designated so-called Indian territory west of the Mississippi, corresponding roughly to what will become Oklahoma. Well, in the space of a couple of generations, you have more encroachment, more invasion. So this is just a temporary measure, a kind of temporary respite before the movement of settlement and the movement of progress continues. So it's a father who tells their child something today just to get them to agree to something, to go along with something, and then turns around and says something different tomorrow. So, wouldn't this set a trend for this idea of America in the long run being in this kind of paternalistic position? And that's often been the way America presented itself, especially during the 1990s, but still today, this idea of being the police of the world, or in a more kind of familiar term as being the parents of other nations, taking care of other countries, going and intervening on their behalf on the assumption that they can't take care of themselves. But this is a kind of trend established from the start in relations with the Native Americans. Okay, well, if America wants to see itself as a kind of father figure to other countries, what kinds of fathers are they really? Okay, go ahead and occupy that role, but let's talk back to exactly what this kind of paternalism really entails for the people that they're supposedly taking care of. All these ideas, as I say, can set these kinds of trends or legacies and are worth thinking about in the contemporary context. Oh, that's it. We ran out of material before we ran out of time. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. I suppose it could be. Anyway, so, sorry?
Question.
Yes, sure. Question, go ahead.
In the removal act, what actually happened? Was it that the Indians, the native who were reasoning was not like the whites, or was it that they were not kind of succumbing to be assimilated in the society and wanted to live autonomously?
Yeah, I would say it was more the latter in terms of the question is, were the natives resistant to this idea of assimilation? And I would say from the start, the resistance to this notion of being incorporated into this larger parent nation, which they regarded as a foreign nation, essentially. I mean, it was not exactly their culture, their religion, and when you talk about something that's as basic and intimate as an attitude towards the natural world, towards labor, towards different social systems, it's not easy just to tell people, okay, all of that is now gone and disappears. Now you belong to this other set of values, other set of cultures. Any other questions? Okay, so let's leave it there today. I'll come back, talk about the Civil War next time.